The earliest traces of what would eventually become Druidic tradition emerge from the archaeological record of Iron Age Europe like whispers from a distant past. Deep within the ritual deposits of sacred springs, beneath the earthen ramparts of hill forts, and within the carefully arranged stone circles that dot the ancient landscape, we find evidence of sophisticated religious practices that predate any written account of the Druids themselves by centuries. At Gournay-sur-Aronde in northern France, excavations have revealed a rectangular enclosure dating to the 3rd century BC, its boundaries marked by a wooden palisade and containing what appears to be a sacred grove. Within this space, archaeologists discovered thousands of weapons, swords, spearheads, shields, deliberately bent and broken before being deposited in carefully dug pits. These weren't discarded battlefield refuse, but ritual offerings, their destruction ensuring they could serve only the gods. The systematic nature of these deposits, their careful placement, and the evident ceremonial protocols involved suggest the presence of an organised priestly class directing these complex rituals. Similar patterns emerge across the Celtic world. At Ribemont-sur-Ancre, also in northern France, excavations revealed a massive ossuary containing the remains of over 1,000 individuals, their bones arranged in precise geometric patterns. The skulls were separated from the bodies and placed in distinct areas, while long bones were sorted and stacked with mathematical precision. This wasn't random violence, but carefully orchestrated ritual activity requiring extensive anatomical knowledge and religious authority to direct such elaborate post-mortem ceremonies. The sacred springs of Britain and Gaul provide perhaps the most compelling evidence for proto-Druidic practices. At Bath's sacred springs dedicated to the goddess Sulis, thousands of curse tablets written on thin sheets of lead have been recovered from the waters. While many date to the Roman period, the practice itself clearly predates Roman arrival. These deficciones, as scholars term them, required not only literacy but deep knowledge of proper formulaic language to compel divine intervention. The complexity of their legal terminology and religious invocations suggests a learned class of religious specialists who understood both divine law and human jurisprudence. Across the Channel at the source of the Seine, similar deposits reveal the sophistication of pre-Roman Celtic religious practice. Wooden sculptures, anatomical votives representing healed body parts, and bronze figurines were carefully deposited in the sacred waters over centuries. The artistic consistency and religious iconography of these offerings indicate established traditions passed down through generations of religious practitioners who maintained both artistic standards and theological doctrine. The construction of major ritual sites provides additional evidence for organised religious authority in pre-Roman Celtic society. The Heuneberg Hill Fort in southwestern Germany, occupied from the 7th to 5th centuries BC, contained elaborate ritual buildings constructed with Mediterranean architectural techniques. These weren't simple shrines, but sophisticated religious complexes requiring extensive planning, specialised knowledge, and coordinated labour forces. The presence of imported luxury goods within these contexts, Greek pottery, Etruscan bronzes, amber from the Baltic, indicates that religious authority commanded significant economic resources and maintained far-reaching trade networks. The Indo-European heritage underlying Celtic religious traditions provides crucial context for understanding Druidic origins. Comparative mythology reveals striking parallels between Celtic religious concepts and those found across the Indo-European world. The tripartite division of society into priests, warriors, and producers that characterise Celtic culture mirrors similar structures in ancient India, Iran, and Rome. This wasn't coincidental borrowing, but reflected shared ancestral traditions carried by Indo-European speaking peoples as they spread across Eurasia during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. The concept of sacred kingship, fundamental to later Celtic political and religious structures, shows clear Indo-European origins. Like their counterparts in Vedic India and ancient Iran, Celtic rulers were expected to maintain cosmic order through proper ritual observance. The king's relationship with the land was conceived in sacred terms. His ritual purity and correct performance of seasonal ceremonies directly affected agricultural fertility and tribal prosperity. This religious dimension of kingship required specialized knowledge of proper protocols, seasonal timing, and ritual procedures that only trained religious specialists could provide. The Indo-European inheritance also included sophisticated concepts of cosmic structure that would later characterize Celtic religious thought. The world tree, connecting the realms of gods, humans, and the dead, appears in Celtic mythology as it does in Germanic, Baltic, and Indo-Iranian traditions. The threefold division of the cosmos, upper world of gods, middle world of humans, and underworld of the dead, provided the basic framework for Celtic religious geography. These weren't simple borrowings, but represented ancient shared concepts that each Indo-European culture developed according to local conditions and historical experiences. The emergence of distinctly Celtic culture across Europe between 1200 and 500 BC created the specific historical context within which Druidic traditions would crystallize. The Hallstatt culture, centered in the salt mining regions of Austria, developed the earliest recognizably Celtic material culture around 800 BC. The wealth generated by salt trade, a commodity essential for food preservation and therefore political power, enabled the development of a warrior aristocracy supported by specialized craftsmen and religious specialists. The Latin culture, emerging around 450 BC, represents the full flowering of Celtic civilization. Named after the ritual site on Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, where thousands of weapons and ornaments were deposited in the waters, Latin culture spread rapidly across Europe from Ireland to Turkey. The artistic style that characterizes this period, flowing curvilinear designs, stylized animal forms, complex geometric patterns, wasn't merely decorative, but encoded religious symbolism requiring trained specialists to interpret and reproduce correctly. The expansion of Celtic culture wasn't simply military conquest, but involved the spread of religious and legal traditions that required educated specialists to maintain. As Celtic tribes established themselves across Europe, they carried with them not just material culture, but complex bodies of oral tradition, including genealogies, legal precedents, religious formulae, and mythological narratives. The preservation and transmission of this knowledge required dedicated specialists who could memorize vast quantities of information and adapt traditional teachings to local conditions. Linguistic analysis of Celtic languages reveals the antiquity and sophistication of religious terminology that predates written records by centuries. The word Druid itself derives from the Proto-Celtic asterisk Druids, combining asterisk Dru with asterisk wid. This compound suggests not simply oak knower, but someone who possessed the ability to perceive sacred knowledge through natural phenomena. The linguistic construction parallels similar compounds in other Indo-European languages, where religious specialists were defined by their ability to see or know hidden truths. The Celtic term Watis, preserved in Irish faith and Welsh Gwaud, designated a type of religious specialist concerned with prophecy and poetic inspiration. The word shares etymological connections with Latin vetus and Germanic terms for prophetic speech, indicating ancient Indo-European concepts of divinely inspired utterance. The preservation of these terms across geographically separated Celtic languages suggests they represented established religious categories maintained through oral tradition over centuries. Sacred geography terminology reveals sophisticated concepts of ritual space that required specialized knowledge to navigate properly. The Celtic asterisk Nemeton, meaning sacred grove or sanctuary, appears in place names across the Celtic world from Drunameton in Asia Minor to Vernametum in Britain. These weren't simply wooded areas, but carefully defined ritual spaces with specific protocols for entry, behaviour, and ceremonial activity. The consistency of terminology across such vast geographical distances indicates standardized religious concepts transmitted through networks of trained specialists. The legal terminology preserved in early Irish and Welsh law texts, reveals the complexity of pre-Christian Celtic jurisprudence. Technical terms for different categories of contracts, property rights, and legal procedures show remarkable consistency with legal concepts found in other Indo-European traditions. The precision of this vocabulary and its systematic application in complex legal scenarios required extensive training that could only be provided by professional legal specialists who combined jurisprudence with religious authority. Seasonal and calendrical terminology demonstrates sophisticated astronomical knowledge integrated with religious observance. The Coligny calendar, discovered in France and dating to the 1st century BC, represents the culmination of centuries of Celtic astronomical observation. Its complex intercalation system, designed to coordinate lunar months with the solar year, required mathematical knowledge and observational skills that could only be maintained by dedicated specialists. The religious terminology embedded within the calendar, designating auspicious and inauspicious periods, seasonal ceremonies, and divine festivals, shows the integration of astronomical knowledge with religious practice. The preservation of mythological narratives in Celtic languages reveals sophisticated theological concepts that required trained specialists to maintain and interpret. The complex genealogies connecting divine and human lineages, the intricate relationships between tribal deities and territorial boundaries, and the elaborate protocols governing interaction between the human and divine realms all demanded extensive memorization and deep understanding of traditional teachings. The transition from archaeological inference to documented historical reality occurs dramatically with Julius Caesar's arrival in Gaul in 58 BC. For the first time in recorded history, we encounter detailed written accounts of the Druids from an outside observer who claimed direct interaction with these enigmatic figures. Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, written between 58 and 50 BC, provides our most comprehensive classical description of Druidic society, though his account must be carefully examined through the lens of Roman political and military objectives. Caesar's description of the Druidic hierarchy reveals a sophisticated religious organisation that controlled significant aspects of Celtic society. According to his account, the Druids formed a distinct social class exempt from military service and taxation, privileges that elevated them above even the warrior aristocracy in certain respects. At the apex of this hierarchy stood a single chief Druid who held supreme authority over all religious matters throughout Gaul. This position was either inherited through succession or, more commonly, elected by the Druidic assembly when the previous holder died. The electoral process Caesar describes suggests a democratic element within Druidic organisation that contrasted sharply with the autocratic structures Romans typically encountered. When multiple candidates sought the chief Druidic position, the decision was made through voting by the assembled Druids. If this process failed to produce a clear winner, armed conflict could result, indicating that despite their religious nature, Druids were willing to employ violence to resolve succession disputes. This detail reveals the substantial political power at stake in Druidic leadership positions. Caesar's account of Druidic education provides remarkable insights into Celtic intellectual culture. He reports that Druidic training required 20 years of intensive study, during which students memorized vast quantities of oral tradition without committing any of it to writing. This prohibition against written records, according to Caesar, served two purposes. It prevented sacred knowledge from falling into unauthorized hands, and it strengthened memory through constant exercise. The curriculum included natural philosophy, astronomy, theology, and what Caesar terms the immortality of souls and their passage after death to other bodies. The geographical scope of Druidic education impressed even Caesar, who noted that students travelled from across Gaul and Britain to study in particular centres of learning. He identifies Britain as the original homeland of Druidic tradition, suggesting that the most advanced teachings could only be obtained there. This claim, if accurate, indicates that despite political fragmentation among Celtic tribes, intellectual and religious networks maintained connections across vast distances and tribal boundaries. Caesar's description of Druidic judicial functions reveals their role as arbiters in both religious and secular disputes. The Druids served as judges in cases involving murder, inheritance, and boundary disputes, with their decisions carrying binding authority backed by the threat of religious sanctions. The most severe punishment they could impose was exclusion from religious ceremonies, which effectively made the condemned person an outcast from society. Caesar notes that individuals suffering this punishment were shunned by all members of their community and could neither participate in religious rites nor seek legal protection. The annual assembly of Druids at a sacred location in the territory of the Carnutes tribe demonstrates the institutional unity underlying Celtic religious organisation. Caesar describes this gathering as occurring at what the Druids considered the centre of Gaul, where representatives from across the Celtic world convened to resolve disputes and coordinate religious policy. The fact that even warring tribes respected the neutrality of this assembly indicates the transcendent authority Druids wielded over political divisions. Caesar's account of Druidic human sacrifice practices provides some of the most controversial material in classical sources. He describes various methods of ritual killing, including the construction of enormous wicker figures filled with living victims and set ablaze. While these descriptions have captured popular imagination, they must be evaluated carefully considering Caesar's political motivations and Roman attitudes toward non-Roman religious practices. The Romans routinely accused foreign peoples of practicing human sacrifice as justification for military intervention and cultural suppression. Archaeological evidence from Celtic sites does confirm the practice of ritual human sacrifice in certain contexts, but the scale and systematic nature Caesar describes may reflect Roman propaganda rather than accurate observation. Bog bodies discovered across northern Europe, some showing evidence of ritual killing, demonstrate that human sacrifice occurred within Celtic religious practice, but these isolated finds hardly support Caesar's claims of widespread routine mass sacrifice. Pliny the Elder's Natural History, completed around 77 as 79 AD, provides a different perspective on Druidic practices focused on their relationship with the natural world. Writing a century after Caesar, Pliny had access to additional sources and could observe the remnants of Druidic tradition that persisted despite Roman suppression efforts. His account emphasizes the botanical and medical knowledge that formed a crucial component of Druidic expertise. Pliny's description of the mistletoe ceremony represents one of the most detailed ritual accounts in classical literature. According to his account, Druids considered mistletoe sacred only when it grew on oak trees, a rare occurrence that made such specimens particularly precious. The harvest ceremony could only be performed on the 6th day of the lunar month, using a golden sickle wielded by a white-robed druid who climbed the tree while other participants waited below with a white cloth to catch the falling plant. The ritual requirements Pliny describes reveal the precision and formality of Druidic ceremonial practice. 2 white bulls were sacrificed during the ceremony, and the harvested mistletoe was distributed among participants who believed it provided protection against poison and enhanced fertility in livestock. The specific timing requirements, the 6th day of the lunar month, demonstrate sophisticated astronomical knowledge integrated with religious observance. Pliny's account of sacred groves provides insights into Celtic concepts of sacred space that archaeological evidence supports. He describes these groves as carefully maintained ritual areas where specific trees were considered dwelling places of particular deities. The Druids served as guardians of these spaces, ensuring that proper protocols were observed and that unauthorized individuals did not disturb the sacred environment. Archaeological excavations at sites like Gournay-sur-Aronde have confirmed the existence of such carefully defined ritual spaces with evidence of long-term maintenance and repeated ceremonial use. The botanical knowledge Pliny attributes to the Druids reflects genuine expertise in herbal medicine and natural philosophy. His catalogue of plants considered sacred by the Druids includes detailed descriptions of their supposed properties and ritual applications. While some of these claims reflect magical thinking rather than empirical observation, others demonstrate accurate knowledge of plant properties that modern pharmacology has confirmed. The systematic nature of this botanical knowledge suggests formal educational traditions that transmitted detailed information about plant identification, preparation methods, and therapeutic applications. Pliny's account of Druidic astronomy reveals sophisticated observational capabilities that enabled accurate calendar construction and seasonal prediction. He describes Druids as capable of predicting eclipses, calculating optimal times for agricultural activities, and determining auspicious periods for various undertakings. This astronomical knowledge required generations of careful observation and mathematical calculation, supporting Caesar's claims about the lengthy educational requirements for Druidic training. Tacitus provides the most dramatic and politically charged accounts of Druidic activities in his Annals and Agricola, written in the early 2nd century AD. His descriptions focus primarily on the final confrontation between Roman authority and Druidic resistance in Britain, particularly the assault on the island of Mona in 60 AD under the command of Suetonius Paulinus. Tacitus's account of the Mona campaign provides vivid details of the final stronghold of British Druidism. He describes the island as heavily fortified and serving as a refuge for rebels from across Britain who sought sanctuary under Druidic protection. The Roman approach to the island was complicated by the need to transport troops across the treacherous waters of the Menai Strait, where tidal currents and shallow areas made naval operations hazardous. The scene Tacitus paints of the British defence of Mona reveals the psychological impact of Druidic resistance on Roman soldiers. He describes armed warriors interspersed with Druids who raised their hands to heaven while invoking curses upon the Roman forces. Women dressed in funeral garments ran among the defenders like furies, carrying torches and adding to the otherworldly atmosphere that initially paralysed the Roman advance. The Druids themselves appeared in white robes, their appearance and ritual gestures creating such an impression that seasoned Roman veterans hesitated to advance. Tacitus records that Suetonius had to personally exhort his troops to overcome their superstitious fears and advance against what he characterized as a savage superstition. The Roman assault, when it finally came, was devastating. The defenders were overwhelmed, the sacred groves were cut down, and the altars were destroyed. Tacitus specifically mentions that the Romans discovered evidence of human sacrifice, including altars soaked with human blood and groves where victims had been hanged. The destruction of Mona represented more than a military victory. It was a deliberate assault on the institutional foundation of British resistance to Roman rule. Tacitus makes clear that the Romans understood the Druids' role in coordinating opposition to Roman authority, and that eliminating their power base was essential for consolidating Roman control over Britain. The timing of the attack, occurring simultaneously with Boudicca's rebellion in eastern Britain, demonstrates Roman recognition of the connection between Druidic authority and organised resistance to Roman rule. Tacitus's broader treatment of Druids in his historical works reveals their continued influence even after official suppression. He mentions Druidic involvement in the revolt of Civilis in 69, 70 AD, where Druidic prophecies encouraged Germanic and Gallic tribes to believe that the burning of the capital in Rome signalled the transfer of world dominion to peoples beyond the Alps. This incident demonstrates that Druidic influence persisted decades after Caesar's conquest of Gaul, and continued to pose challenges to Roman authority. The critical analysis of these classical sources requires careful consideration of Roman cultural biases and political objectives that shaped their accounts. Roman authors wrote for Roman audiences with specific expectations about barbarian peoples and their religious practices. The Romans had a complex relationship with foreign religions, sometimes incorporating useful elements while condemning practices that conflicted with Roman values or political interests. The accusation of human sacrifice appears consistently across Roman accounts of various non-Roman peoples, from Carthaginians to Germans to Celts. While archaeological evidence confirms that ritual human sacrifice occurred in Celtic contexts, the systematic and extensive nature described by Roman authors likely reflects literary conventions rather than accurate reporting. Roman authors used accusations of human sacrifice to justify military intervention and cultural suppression, making it difficult to distinguish factual observation from propaganda. The Roman emphasis on Druidic secrecy and refusal to commit teachings to writing may reflect genuine Celtic practices, but it also served Roman rhetorical purposes by portraying Druids as deliberately obscure and potentially subversive. The Romans valued written law and public discourse, so the Druidic reliance on oral tradition could be portrayed as primitive or deliberately deceptive. However, the sophistication of Celtic legal and astronomical knowledge preserved in later Irish and Welsh sources suggests that oral transmission was a deliberate choice rather than an inability to develop writing systems. The political dimensions of Roman accounts become particularly apparent in their treatment of Druidic resistance to Roman authority. Roman authors consistently portray Druids as the primary organisers of anti-Roman sentiment, suggesting that eliminating Druidic influence was essential for successful conquest. While this assessment may have been accurate, it also served to justify harsh suppression measures and deflect attention from legitimate grievances that motivated Celtic resistance to Roman rule. The geographical claims and classical sources also require careful evaluation. Caesar's assertion that Druidism originated in Britain and spread to Gaul may reflect genuine historical tradition, but it could also serve his political purposes by suggesting that conquering Britain was necessary to eliminate Druidic influence entirely. Similarly, the emphasis on the unity of Druidic organisation across tribal boundaries may exaggerate the actual coordination among Celtic religious specialists for dramatic effect. Despite these limitations, the classical sources provide invaluable information about Druidic practices and social organisation that archaeological evidence alone cannot supply. The detailed descriptions of educational practices, judicial functions, and ceremonial activities offer insights into Celtic intellectual culture that complement material evidence from excavations. The consistency of certain details across different authors and time periods suggests that some aspects of their accounts reflect accurate observation rather than literary convention. The integration of classical sources with archaeological evidence and later Celtic literary traditions allows for a more nuanced understanding of Druidic society than any single source could provide. While Roman authors clearly had political and cultural biases that influenced their accounts, their direct contact with Celtic society during the conquest period provides contemporary observations that, when carefully analysed, reveal significant aspects of Druidic organisation and practice. The physical landscape of Celtic territories served as far more than mere backdrop to Druidic activities. It functioned as a carefully organised sacred geography, where natural features held specific religious significance and ritual purpose. Archaeological investigations across Europe have revealed systematic patterns in how Celtic communities organised their religious spaces, creating networks of sacred sites that connected local tribal territories with broader regional and pan-Celtic religious traditions. The identification of nemata, or sacred groves, represents one of the most significant developments in understanding Celtic religious geography. These carefully maintained woodland sanctuaries appear throughout the archaeological record from Scotland to Asia Minor, their locations marked by distinctive artefact assemblages and structural remains that distinguish them from ordinary settlements or burial sites. At Gournay-sur-Aronde in northern France, excavations revealed a rectangular enclosure measuring approximately 45 by 38 metres, surrounded by a wooden palisade with a single entrance facing east. Within this defined space, archaeologists discovered evidence of continuous ritual activity spanning over 2 centuries, from the 3rd century BC through the Roman conquest period. The Gournay site demonstrates the sophisticated organisation of nematon spaces. The central area contained a wooden temple structure built according to specific architectural principles that remained consistent across multiple reconstruction phases. Surrounding this temple, carefully arranged pits contained thousands of weapons, iron swords, spearheads, shields and helmets that had been deliberately damaged before deposition. The systematic nature of this destruction, involving specific bending and breaking patterns, indicates established ritual protocols that required specialised knowledge to execute properly. Similar Nemean sites across Celtic Europe reveal standardised approaches to sacred space organisation, despite significant geographical separation. At Mirabeau-sur-Bèze in Burgundy, a square enclosure dating to the 2nd century BZ contained a central wooden building surrounded by pits filled with animal bones, pottery fragments and metalwork. The bone assemblages show evidence of systematic butchering and distribution, suggesting communal feasting activities that required coordination by religious specialists familiar with proper ceremonial procedures. The Ribemont-sur-Ancre site in Picardy provides particularly striking evidence for the scale and complexity of Nemean activities. This sanctuary, active from the 3rd to 1st centuries BC, contained a massive ossuary where human remains were arranged according to strict anatomical principles. Skulls were separated from postcranial elements and placed in distinct areas, while long bones were sorted by type and stacked in geometric patterns. This systematic organisation of human remains required extensive anatomical knowledge and religious authority to direct such elaborate post-mortem ceremonies. Archaeological investigation of British Nemeta reveals similar organisational principles adapted to local geographical conditions. The Hayling Island Sanctuary in Hampshire, active from the 1st century BC through the Roman period, occupied a hilltop location overlooking the Solent. The site contained a circular wooden temple surrounded by a square enclosure with evidence of metalwork deposition, animal sacrifice, and votive offerings spanning several centuries. The consistency of ritual deposits and architectural features across multiple building phases indicates continuous maintenance by trained religious specialists. Stone circles represent another crucial component of Celtic sacred geography, though their relationship to historical Druidic practices remains complex due to their much earlier construction dates. The majority of British and Irish stone circles were erected during the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, centuries before the emergence of recognisable Celtic culture. However, archaeological evidence demonstrates continued use and modification of these ancient monuments throughout the Iron Age, suggesting that Druids incorporated pre-existing sacred sites into their religious system. Stonehenge provides the most extensively studied example of this phenomenon. While the monument's primary construction phases date to the 3rd millennium BC, archaeological evidence reveals significant Iron Age activity at the site. Excavations have uncovered Celtic pottery, metalwork and human remains dating to the period of documented Druidic activity in Britain. The discovery of cremated human remains in the Aubrey Holes, some dating to the Iron Age, suggests that Druids may have used the ancient monument for burial ceremonies connected to their religious practices. The Rollright stones in Oxfordshire demonstrate similar patterns of Iron Age reuse of earlier monuments. This Bronze Age stone circle shows evidence of continued ritual activity throughout the Celtic period, including the deposition of metalwork and the modification of individual stones. Local place name evidence suggests that the site retained religious significance into the medieval period, indicating continuity of sacred associations across multiple cultural transitions. Burial mounds and barrows throughout Celtic territories reveal sophisticated concepts of landscape organisation that connected the living community with ancestral spirits and territorial boundaries. The Hockdorf burial in southwestern Germany, dating to the 6th century BC, exemplifies the integration of individual burials within broader sacred landscapes. The massive tumulus, measuring over 60 metres in diameter, was positioned to be visible from surrounding settlements and aligned with significant astronomical events. The Vix burial in Burgundy, containing the remains of a high-status woman accompanied by extraordinary grave goods, including a massive bronze crater, demonstrates how elite burials served as focal points for territorial organisation. The burial mound's position commanded extensive views across the surrounding landscape, while its proximity to the Mont-la-Soie hill fort suggests integration with political and religious centres of power. Irish passage tombs such as Newgrange, Noath and Douth in the Boyne Valley represent earlier traditions that Celtic communities incorporated into their religious geography. While these monuments date to the Neolithic period, medieval Irish texts describe them as Sid or fairy mounds, associated with the Tuatha de Danann and other supernatural beings. The continued significance of these sites in Irish tradition suggests that Druids maintained connections with ancient sacred places, adapting earlier religious concepts to Celtic theological frameworks. The ritual landscape approach to Celtic sacred geography reveals how individual sites functioned as components of integrated religious systems rather than isolated sanctuaries. In the Trier region of Germany, archaeological survey has identified clusters of Celtic temples, burial mounds and votive deposits, organised according to specific spatial relationships. These site complexes were connected by ancient trackways, facilitated movement between different ritual locations during seasonal ceremonies or religious festivals. Water worship formed a fundamental component of Celtic religious practice, with springs, wells and rivers serving as crucial interfaces between the human and divine realms. The therapeutic springs at Bath, dedicated to the goddess Sulis, provide exceptional evidence for the sophistication of Celtic water cults. The natural hot springs, emerging at a constant temperature of 46 degrees Celsius, were developed into an elaborate sanctuary complex that attracted visitors from across Roman Britain and beyond. Archaeological excavations at Bath have recovered over 12,000 Roman coins thrown into the sacred spring as votive offerings, along with pewter vessels, jewellery and gemstones. Most significantly, the site has yielded approximately 130 curse tablets written on thin lead sheets and deposited in the spring waters. These defixianes, written in Latin but following Celtic legal and religious formulae, demonstrate the persistence of indigenous religious practices within the Roman cultural framework. The curse tablets reveal sophisticated understanding of divine law and proper procedures for seeking supernatural intervention in human disputes. The tablets typically begin with invocations to Sulis Minerva, combining the Celtic goddess with her Roman counterpart, followed by detailed descriptions of alleged crimes and requests for specific punishments. The legal terminology and formulaic language employed in these texts required specialised knowledge that could only be provided by religious specialists familiar with both Celtic and Roman legal traditions. Similar water sanctuaries across Celtic Europe demonstrate the widespread importance of spring and river worship in Celtic religious practice. At the source of the Seine in Burgundy, the sanctuary of Sequana yielded thousands of votive offerings deposited over several centuries. Wooden sculptures representing healed body parts, bronze figurines of pilgrims, and miniature representations of internal organs indicate that the site functioned as a healing sanctuary where visitors sought divine intervention for medical conditions. The Fonte Sequani site reveals the organised nature of Celtic pilgrimage practices. The votive deposits show evidence of systematic production by specialised craftsmen who created standardised offering types for different categories of supplicants. Anatomical votives were carved according to established artistic conventions, while bronze figurines followed consistent iconographic patterns that required training to execute properly. This standardisation suggests institutional oversight by religious specialists who maintained artistic and theological standards across extended periods. River deposits throughout Celtic territories provide additional evidence for water-focused ritual practices. The Thames in particular has yielded extraordinary quantities of high-status metalwork deposited during the Iron Age period. Weapons, tools, ornaments and cauldrons were thrown into the river at specific locations, often near fords or confluences that held special geographical significance. The concentration of these deposits at particular spots indicates established ritual sites, where ceremonies were conducted according to specific protocols. The Battersea Shield, discovered in the Thames and dating to the 1st century BC, exemplifies the quality of metalwork deposited in river sanctuaries. This bronze shield, decorated with elaborate Latini artistic motifs and originally fitted with glass studs, was clearly a prestige object rather than functional military equipment. Its deposition in the Thames represents a significant sacrifice that required authorization by religious authorities capable of determining appropriate offerings for water deities. Sacred wells throughout the Celtic world demonstrate the persistence of water worship traditions from prehistory through the medieval period. The Carroburg Mithraeum on Hadrian's Wall contained a sacred well where Roman soldiers deposited offerings to Celtic water deities alongside their devotions to Mithras. The site yielded altars dedicated to local nymphs and water spirits, indicating the continuation of indigenous religious practices within Roman military contexts. Irish holy wells preserve extensive evidence for Celtic water worship traditions that survived Christianization. Medieval texts describe elaborate ceremonies conducted at sacred springs, including circuits performed in specific directions, offerings deposited in the water, and healing rituals conducted by specialized practitioners. The persistence of these practices into the modern period suggests deep-rooted traditions that originated in pre-Christian Celtic religious systems. The island of Mona, known today as Anglesey, occupied a position of supreme importance within the sacred geography of Celtic Britain. Classical sources consistently identify Mona as the primary centre of Druidic learning and religious authority, a claim supported by archaeological evidence for intensive ritual activity spanning several centuries. The island's geographical position, separated from mainland Wales by the treacherous waters of the Menai Strait, provided natural protection that enabled the development of major religious institutions without interference from external political authorities. Tacitus's account of the Roman assault on Mona in 60 AD describes the island as heavily fortified and serving as a refuge for rebels from across Britain who sought sanctuary under Druidic protection. The Roman commander Suetonius Paulinus recognized that eliminating Druidic influence required the destruction of their institutional base on Mona, making the island's conquest a strategic priority despite the military challenges involved in mounting an amphibious assault across dangerous tidal waters. Archaeological investigation of Anglesey has revealed extensive evidence for Iron Age religious activity that supports classical claims about the island's significance. The Lyn Cerrig Bach deposit, discovered during construction of an RAF airfield in 1942, contained over 150 metalwork objects deposited in a lake over approximately 150 years during the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. The assemblage includes weapons, vehicle fittings, slave chains, cauldrons, and currency bars that represent offerings from across Britain and Ireland. The geographical distribution of objects in the Lyn Cerrig Bach deposit demonstrates Mona's role as a centre for pan-British religious activity. Weapons show stylistic influences from Scotland, Northern England and Ireland, while vehicle fittings display artistic motifs characteristic of continental Celtic metalwork traditions. This diversity indicates that the site attracted offerings from communities across the Celtic world, supporting classical claims about Mona's supreme religious status. The slave chains discovered at Lyn Cerrig Bach provide disturbing evidence for the human cost of Celtic religious practices. These iron restraints, designed to secure multiple individuals in linked groups, were deposited in the lake as votive offerings, along with other high-value metalwork. The presence of such objects in a religious context suggests that human trafficking and slavery formed components of the economic system that supported major Celtic sanctuaries. Additional archaeological sites on Anglesey reveal the extent of Iron Age religious activity across the island. The Bryn Celli DDU passage tomb, originally constructed during the Neolithic period, shows evidence of continued use and modification throughout the Iron Age. The site contained cremated human remains, pottery and metalwork dating to the Celtic period, indicating that ancient burial monuments were incorporated into contemporary religious practices. The Din Ligui Hut group on Anglesey provides evidence for specialised religious communities that may have been associated with Druidic training institutions. This late Iron Age settlement contained several round stone buildings arranged within a defensive enclosure, with evidence for metalworking, fine pottery production, and the consumption of high-status foods. The site's location, architectural sophistication, and artefact assemblage suggest occupation by religious specialists rather than ordinary farming communities. Holyhead Mountain on Anglesey contains extensive evidence for Iron Age ritual activity, including stone circles, burial cairns, and settlement remains that span several centuries. The mountain's prominent position, visible from across the Irish Sea, made it an ideal location for astronomical observation and seasonal ceremonies. Archaeological survey has identified multiple stone alignments oriented towards significant celestial events, suggesting systematic observation of astronomical phenomena by trained specialists. The sacred geography of Celtic lands reveals sophisticated understanding of landscape organisation that integrated natural features with human-constructed ritual spaces. This system required extensive coordination by religious specialists who maintained knowledge of proper site locations, ceremonial protocols, and seasonal timing for different types of religious activity. The archaeological evidence demonstrates that Druids functioned as the institutional framework that organised and maintained this complex sacred landscape across the Celtic world. The institutional structure that governed Celtic religious and intellectual life reveals a sophisticated hierarchy that extended far beyond the simple priest-warrior-farmer divisions familiar from other Indo-European societies. Archaeological evidence combined with classical sources and later Celtic literary traditions demonstrates that Druidic organisation comprised three distinct but interconnected orders, each with specialised functions, educational requirements, and social responsibilities that collectively maintain the complex fabric of Celtic civilization. At the apex of this system stood the Druids proper, whose primary functions encompassed judicial authority, advanced education, and diplomatic mediation between tribal groups. These figures wielded extraordinary power within Celtic society, serving as supreme arbiters in legal disputes that range from property boundaries to accusations of murder. Their judicial authority transcended tribal loyalties, enabling them to resolve conflicts between different Celtic communities and maintain legal consistency across geographically dispersed populations. The uniform legal terminology preserved in early Irish and Welsh law texts demonstrates the effectiveness of this system in transmitting complex jurisprudential concepts across vast distances and extended time periods. The educational responsibilities of the Druids proper involved training the next generation of religious specialists in the most advanced aspects of Celtic intellectual tradition. This instruction covered natural philosophy, astronomical observation, theological doctrine, and the intricate legal precedents that governed Celtic society. Students seeking admission to this highest level of Druidic education had typically already completed extensive preliminary training in memorization techniques, basic legal principles, and fundamental religious concepts. The 20-year educational period Caesar describes likely represents the total duration required to achieve full Druidic status, beginning with elementary instruction and culminating in mastery of the most esoteric teachings. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Hochdorf burial and the Vix tomb reveals the material wealth and social prestige associated with the highest levels of Druidic authority. The grave goods accompanying these elite burials include imported luxury items from across Europe and the Mediterranean, indicating that senior Druids commanded extensive trade networks and accumulated substantial economic resources. The presence of specialised craftwork, including intricate metalwork and exotic materials, suggests that Druidic institutions supported communities of skilled artisans who produced the ceremonial objects required for religious rituals. The second tier of the Druidic hierarchy consisted of the bards, whose specialised functions centred on the preservation and performance of historical narratives, genealogical records, and poetic compositions that encoded legal and religious knowledge within memorable, artistic forms. These figures served as the primary repositories of Celtic cultural memory, maintaining vast collections of oral literature that preserved tribal histories, mythological traditions, and legal precedents spanning multiple generations. Their training emphasized verbal artistry, musical composition, and the complex metrical systems that facilitated accurate memorization of extended narrative sequences. Bardic education involved mastery of multiple poetic forms, each suited to different social occasions and communicative purposes. Praise poetry celebrating the achievements of warriors and rulers required intimate knowledge of military tactics, genealogical connections, and the specific deeds that merited commemoration. Satirical compositions, which Celtic tradition credited with supernatural power to cause physical harm to their targets, demanded understanding of social relationships and political tensions that could be exploited through verbal attack. Legal poetry encoded complex jurisprudential principles within metrical frameworks that enabled precise transmission of technical terminology across generations of oral tradition. The social functions of bards extended beyond mere entertainment to encompass crucial roles in political legitimization and social cohesion. Their genealogical knowledge validated the claims of rulers to legitimate authority by tracing royal lineages back to divine or semi-divine ancestors. During succession disputes, bardic testimony regarding bloodline connections could determine the outcome of political conflicts, making these figures essential participants in the power structures of Celtic society. Their presence at royal courts provided rulers with both ceremonial validation and practical advice based on historical precedent and traditional wisdom. Archaeological evidence for bardic activities appears in the form of specialized musical instruments and performance spaces discovered at high-status Celtic sites. The Deskford Carnix, a bronze war trumpet decorated with elaborate boar's head terminals, demonstrates the sophisticated musical technology available to Celtic performers. Similar instruments discovered across Celtic Europe reveal standardized construction techniques and decorative motifs that suggest coordinated production by specialized craftsmen working according to established artistic traditions. Performance spaces within Celtic settlements show evidence of acoustic considerations and audience arrangements that facilitated bardic presentations. The amphitheatre-like arrangements discovered at some hillfoot sites provided natural acoustics that enabled single performers to address large audiences without amplification. The positioning of these spaces within settlement layouts indicates their integration into the regular social activities of Celtic communities, suggesting that bardic performances occurred frequently rather than only during special occasions. The third component of the Druidic hierarchy comprised the Vates, whose specialized knowledge encompassed divination, healing practices, and the interpretation of natural omens that guided both individual decisions and community policies. These figures possessed extensive understanding of herbal medicine, surgical techniques, and the astronomical observations that determined auspicious timing for various undertakings. Their medical knowledge combined empirical observation of plant properties with theoretical frameworks derived from Celtic concepts of cosmic harmony and divine intervention in human affairs. The divinatory practices of the Vates involved multiple techniques for obtaining supernatural guidance regarding future events and appropriate courses of action. Classical sources describe various methods, including the observation of bird flight patterns, the interpretation of animal entrails, and the casting of wooden lots marked with symbolic designs. Archaeological discoveries of divination equipment, including sets of marked bones and specialized containers for ritual casting, confirm the material culture associated with these practices. Healing sanctuaries throughout Celtic territories provide extensive evidence for the medical knowledge and therapeutic practices maintained by the Vates. The sanctuary of Sequana at the source of the Seine yielded thousands of anatomical votive offerings, representing specific body parts that pilgrims sought to heal through divine intervention. The accuracy of these anatomical representations demonstrates detailed knowledge of human anatomy that could only be acquired through systematic study and practical experience with medical conditions. The wooden sculptures discovered at Sequana include representations of internal organs, limbs affected by specific diseases, and complete human figures showing various pathological conditions. The precision of these carvings indicates that Celtic medical practitioners possessed sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and pathology that enabled accurate diagnosis and targeted treatment of specific ailments. The standardized artistic conventions employed in these votives suggest institutional oversight by trained specialists who maintained consistent standards for medical representation. Herbal medicine formed a crucial component of Vatic medical practice, as evidenced by the botanical knowledge preserved in later Celtic literary traditions and confirmed by archaeological discoveries of medicinal plants at religious sites. The systematic organization of this knowledge, including detailed information about plant identification, preparation methods, and therapeutic applications, required extensive training that could only be provided by experienced practitioners familiar with both theoretical principles and practical techniques. The integration of astronomical observation with medical practice reflects the sophisticated theoretical framework underlying Celtic healing traditions. The timing of herbal collection, the scheduling of surgical procedures, and the administration of therapeutic treatments were all coordinated with celestial observations that determined optimal conditions for different medical interventions. This integration of empirical medical knowledge with astronomical timing demonstrates the systematic approach Celtic practitioners brought to healthcare delivery. The educational system that prepared individuals for roles within the Druidic hierarchy represents one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of ancient European civilization. The 20-year training period Caesar describes involved progressive advancement through increasingly specialized levels of instruction, beginning with basic memorization techniques and fundamental religious concepts before advancing to the most esoteric aspects of Celtic intellectual tradition. This extended educational process produced specialists whose knowledge encompassed law, medicine, astronomy, theology, history, and natural philosophy within integrated theoretical frameworks. The prohibition against written records that Caesar notes served multiple functions within the Druidic educational system. By requiring students to memorize vast quantities of information, rather than relying on written texts, the system strengthened memory capacity and ensured that graduates possessed immediate access to their knowledge without dependence on external resources. The oral transmission of knowledge also maintained strict control over access to specialized information, preventing unauthorized individuals from acquiring religious or legal knowledge that could be misused for personal advantage. The memorization techniques employed in Druidic education involved sophisticated mnemonic systems that encoded complex information within memorable poetic and narrative frameworks. Legal principles were embedded within mythological stories that illustrated their practical application, while astronomical data was preserved within seasonal narratives that connected celestial observations with agricultural activities and religious ceremonies. This integration of practical knowledge with memorable artistic forms enabled accurate transmission of technical information across multiple generations of oral tradition. The geographical scope of Druidic education created intellectual networks that transcended political boundaries and tribal loyalties throughout the Celtic world. Students travelled from distant territories to study at renowned educational centres, creating personal connections that facilitated communication and coordination between geographically separated Celtic communities. These educational networks enabled the maintenance of consistent legal and religious traditions across the vast expanse of Celtic settlement from Ireland to Asia Minor. The curriculum of advanced Druidic education encompassed natural philosophy that addressed fundamental questions about the structure of the universe, the nature of divine powers, and the relationship between human society and cosmic order. This instruction included detailed astronomical observation that enabled accurate calendar construction, eclipse prediction, and the determination of optimal timing for various activities. The mathematical knowledge required for these calculations demonstrates the sophisticated intellectual capabilities developed within Druidic educational institutions. Gender roles within Druidic society present complex patterns that defy simple categorization according to modern expectations about ancient gender restrictions. Classical sources provide limited but significant references to female religious specialists who exercised authority within Celtic religious institutions, while archaeological evidence reveals women occupying high-status positions that may have been connected to religious functions. The integration of this evidence with later Celtic literary traditions suggests that women participated in Druidic activities across multiple levels of the institutional hierarchy. The Vix burial in Burgundy provides the most spectacular archaeological evidence for high-status women in Celtic society who may have held religious authority. The massive bronze crater discovered in this 6th century BC burial, capable of holding over 1,000 litres of liquid, represents one of the largest metal vessels known from the ancient world. The burial's position, commanding extensive territorial views, and its proximity to major hill fort complexes suggest that the interred woman wielded significant political and possibly religious authority within her community. Additional female burials throughout Celtic Europe reveal patterns of grave goods and burial treatment that indicate specialised roles possibly connected to religious functions. The Rheinheim burial in Germany contained a woman accompanied by elaborate jewellery, imported luxury goods, and specialised equipment that may have been used for divination or ceremonial purposes. The quality and variety of these grave goods indicate that high-status Celtic women could accumulate substantial wealth and social prestige through their specialised activities. Classical references to female Druids appear in later Roman sources that describe women serving as priestesses, prophets, and advisors to political leaders. Tacitus mentions women participating in the defence of Mona alongside male Druids, suggesting that female religious specialists shared in the political and military aspects of Druidic resistance to Roman conquest. These references, while limited, indicate that women could achieve positions of religious authority that enabled them to participate in the highest levels of Celtic political activity. The archaeological evidence from healing sanctuaries suggests that women may have played particularly important roles as medical practitioners within the Vatic order. The anatomical votives discovered at sites like Sequana include numerous representations of female reproductive organs and conditions specific to women's health, indicating specialised knowledge of gynecological medicine that was likely maintained by female practitioners. The precision and detail of these representations suggests systematic study of women's medical conditions by specialists familiar with female anatomy and reproductive health. Irish literary traditions preserve extensive evidence for female religious specialists who exercised significant authority within pre-Christian Celtic society. The figure of the Bandrui, or female druid, appears frequently in medieval Irish texts as a powerful practitioner of magic, prophecy and healing, who could influence the outcomes of battles and political conflicts. While these sources date to the medieval period, their consistent portrayal of female religious authority suggests the preservation of ancient traditions regarding women's roles within Druidic institutions. The social status of Druids within Celtic society reflected their essential functions as mediators between human communities and divine powers, arbiters of legal disputes, and guardians of cultural traditions that maintained social cohesion across tribal boundaries. Their exemption from military service and taxation, as noted by Caesar, elevated them above the warrior aristocracy in certain respects, while acknowledging their specialised contributions to community welfare. This privileged status enabled Druids to accumulate substantial wealth, maintain extensive educational institutions, and exercise political influence that extended across tribal territories. The advisory relationships between Druids and Celtic rulers created complex dynamics that balanced royal authority with religious oversight of political decisions. Kings and tribal leaders relied on Druidic knowledge of legal precedent astronomical timing and divine will to guide their policy decisions and validate their authority to rule. This dependence on Druidic expertise provided religious specialists with significant influence over political affairs while maintaining the theoretical supremacy of secular rulers in military and administrative matters. The diplomatic functions of Druids enabled them to serve as neutral mediators in conflicts between different tribal groups, facilitating negotiations and treaty arrangements that might otherwise have been impossible due to traditional enmities and competing territorial claims. Their religious authority transcended political boundaries, enabling them to invoke supernatural sanctions against treaty violations and provide credible guarantees for negotiated agreements. This diplomatic role required extensive knowledge of legal traditions, genealogical relationships, and territorial boundaries that could only be maintained through systematic education and institutional memory. The fundamental architecture of Celtic religious thought rested upon a sophisticated understanding of existence that transcended the simple binary of life and death, familiar in many ancient cultures. Archaeological evidence from Celtic burial sites across Europe reveals consistent patterns of grave goods, body positioning and tomb construction that reflect deeply held beliefs about the soul's continuation beyond physical death. The Hochdorf burial in southwestern Germany, dating to the 6th century BC, exemplifies this worldview through its elaborate preparation of the deceased for an afterlife journey that would require the same material necessities as earthly existence. The burial chamber at Hochdorf contained not merely personal possessions, but an entire household's worth of equipment, arranged with meticulous attention to functional accessibility. Bronze vessels for drinking, cauldrons for food preparation, and even a four-wheeled wagon positioned near the burial couch suggest that the deceased was expected to maintain the same social status and daily activities in the afterlife as he had enjoyed in life. The presence of mead residues in drinking horns and evidence of fermented beverages in bronze containers indicates that Celtic concepts of post-mortem existence included sensory experiences identical to those of living humans. The orientation of Celtic burials provides crucial insights into beliefs about the soul's journey after death. Across different regions and time periods, Celtic graves consistently face westward toward the setting sun, suggesting that the deceased were expected to follow solar pathways into otherworldly realms. The Vix burial in Burgundy demonstrates this pattern while adding complexity through its positioning on elevated terrain that commanded extensive territorial views. This placement suggests that high-status individuals were expected to maintain protective oversight of their earthly territories even after death. The concept of metempsychosis, or transmigration of souls between different forms of existence, appears consistently in classical sources describing Celtic beliefs and finds confirmation in archaeological evidence from ritual sites throughout Celtic territories. Caesar's account of Druidic teaching regarding the immortality of souls and their passage after death to other bodies reflects sophisticated theological concepts that integrated individual survival with cosmic cycles of death and renewal. The systematic nature of weapon deposits at sites like Gournay-sur-Aronde, where thousands of items were ritually destroyed before deposition, suggests ceremonies designed to transfer objects from the material world to otherworldly realms where they could serve new purposes. The ritual destruction of valuable objects before their deposition in sacred contexts reflects beliefs about the transformation necessary for material goods to function in otherworldly realms. At La Tène on Lake Neuchâtel, the massive deposits of weapons, tools and ornaments show consistent patterns of deliberate damage that rendered them useless for earthly purposes while presumably preparing them for otherworldly service. The precision of this destruction, involving specific bending and breaking techniques applied to different categories of objects, indicates established protocols that required specialized knowledge to execute properly. Animal sacrifice practices throughout Celtic territories reveal additional dimensions of beliefs about soul transmigration and otherworldly existence. The systematic butchering patterns discovered at sites like Gournay-sur-Aronde demonstrate careful separation of different anatomical elements according to specific ritual requirements. Skulls were treated differently from postcranial remains, while certain bones were arranged in geometric patterns that may have encoded theological concepts about the relationship between physical and spiritual aspects of existence. The treatment of human remains at Celtic ritual sites provides the most direct evidence for beliefs about soul survival and otherworldly journey requirements. At Ribemont-sur-Ancre, the massive ossuary containing over 1,000 individuals arranged in precise anatomical groupings reflects systematic concepts about post-mortem existence that required specific preparation of physical remains. The separation of skulls from other skeletal elements and their placement in distinct areas suggests beliefs about different aspects of human identity that required separate treatment for successful otherworldly transition. The geographical conception of otherworldly realms within Celtic cosmology reveals sophisticated understanding of spatial relationships that connected earthly territories with supernatural domains through specific landscape features and seasonal transitions. The Welsh concept of Annwn and the Irish Tir na Nog represent parallel traditions describing otherworldly realms that existed in complex relationship with the physical world rather than simple opposition to it. These domains were accessible through particular geographical locations and during specific temporal conditions that required specialized knowledge to navigate safely. The identification of thin places or locations where the boundary between worlds became permeable created a sacred geography that integrated otherworldly access points with territorial organization and seasonal ceremonies. Archaeological evidence from sites like Newgrange in Ireland demonstrates how passage tombs were positioned to capture specific astronomical events that marked periods of increased otherworldly accessibility. The winter solstice alignment at Newgrange, where sunlight penetrates the burial chamber only during the shortest days of the year, suggests systematic coordination between celestial observations and beliefs about otherworldly communication. Sacred springs throughout Celtic territories functioned as crucial interfaces between earthly and otherworldly realms, providing locations where humans could communicate with supernatural beings and deposit offerings intended for otherworldly recipients. The therapeutic springs at Bath, dedicated to the goddess Sulis, attracted pilgrims who sought healing through direct contact with otherworldly powers accessible through the naturally heated waters. The thousands of curse tablets deposited in the spring reveal sophisticated understanding of legal procedures that
Thầy thuốc cũng áp dụng các phương pháp như mổ vợ, mổ nội soi, mổ laser. Tuy vẫn đạt được hiệu quả điều trị, nhưng các phương pháp này lại có nhược điểm như thời gian thở lâu, rất năng thở, có thể gây nhiễm trùng của biến chứng, không chăm sóc hậu phẫu kéo dài.
Linh tinh đấy.